Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Berkeley Center for New Media's Commons Conversations. My name is Keith Feldman, and I'm an associate professor of ethnic studies and an executive committee member of the Berkeley Center for New Media, which we call BCNM. BCNM is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological fairness and equity in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. BCNM is committed to promoting technological equity and justice. As such, our free events are inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free spaces. We do not tolerate hate speech. Attendees who violate any of the community guidelines will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future online events. If you're new to our events, welcome. We'll share a link to our community agreements in the chat. Before we begin, I'd also like to take a moment to honor the land. We recognize that Berkeley is located in the territory of Huichun, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the Confederated villages of Lijan. The history of prolific technological development in this region has always depended on this land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. We encourage attendees to explore native-land.ca to learn about the native stewards of the land you're joining us from. You can find more information on the About section of our website. Today, we are pleased to host Liat Berdugo as part of BCNM's Commons Conversation series. Liat Berdugo is an artist and writer whose work investigates embodiment, labor, and militarization in relation to capitalism, technological utopianism, and the Middle East. Her work has been exhibited and screened at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, MoMA PS1 in New York, Transmediale in Berlin, V2 Lab for the Unstable Media in Rotterdam, and the Wrong Biennale online, among many others. Her writing appears in Rhizome, Temporary Art Review, Real Life, Places, and the Institute for Network Cultures, among others. And her latest book, which she'll talk to us about today, is entitled The Weaponized Camera in the Middle East, published earlier this year by Bloomsbury. Berdugo is one half of the art collective, Anxious to Make, and is the co-founder of the Living Room Light Exchange, a monthly new media art series. Berdugo received an MFA from RISD and a BA from Brown University. She's currently an associate professor of art and architecture at the University of San Francisco. The title of Berdugo's talk today is Seeing is Not Enough: Citizen Videography in Israel-Palestine. Let's take a moment to welcome Liat to the Berkeley Center for New Media.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen and get my slides going. Okay. And I also want to thank Abigail DeKosnik, the director of BCNM, as well as the staff of BCNM who made this event possible. I will talk for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then Keith will moderate a Q&A. And I encourage you at any time during my talk to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and can come back to them later. So I won't be tracking that as we go, but feel free to pop them in as they occur to you. Okay, So this talk draws from my book, The Weaponized Camera in the Middle East, Videography, Aesthetics, and Politics in Israel and Palestine, which Keith mentioned came out earlier this year from Bloomsbury, I.B.Tauris. And this book is about the effort to secure political justice through the use of citizen videography, meaning everyday people with cell phones and video cameras faced against the authorities, and specifically to do this in Israel-Palestine. Before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about me. So I'm a visual artist and I work with new media and video. I make a living by teaching at USF, where I teach designers how to code and think about technology in a culturally critical way. I'm an American and an Israeli citizen. And when I was living in Tel Aviv in 2013, I met the director of the B'Tselem Camera Project. And this project is an initiative that distributes video cameras to Palestinians living in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in an effort to combat human rights violations of the Israeli occupation. And this project began in 2007. So to give you some context, that's 3 years before the Arab Spring brought vast attention to the emancipatory potential of technology. Today, there are around 200 B'Tselem issued cameras in the field. And B'Tselem has amassed an archive of over 4,500 hours of raw footage, only a fraction of which is published online. And one thing that distinguishes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more than any other conflicts of its kind is the freedom to record. So Israeli law is more lenient on recording in public than the US state of Massachusetts is, for instance. And I began going into B'Tselem's headquarters to watch these videos, sort of as an effort to see this conflict through a lens that was not my own. So as a citizen of Israel, I'm forbidden by Israeli law from going to major Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Jenin, or Hebron. So I couldn't see these things firsthand. And I've since gone to these places on my American passport to meet with Palestinians who videotape for B'Tselem. And I came to this work in a very specific way, and that is this. I am not an expert on Middle East studies, history, or politics, but I am trained to think about how new media change, exacerbate, or highlight structural systems. And I am trained to think about how things look. So aesthetics, video frames, framing, the visual realm, and visual culture. So this visual approach is really important in Israel-Palestine because the Israeli occupation has devoted considerable national effort to a distinctly visual erasure of Palestinians by doing things like planting forests over ruins of Palestinian villages, supplanting Arab streets and town names with Hebrew ones, creating separate and visually isolated roadways through the West Bank for Israeli citizens, and of course, creating an 8-meter tall concrete wall that literally blocks non-citizen Palestinians from view. At the same time, the Israeli occupation has also devoted significant visual domination over Palestinians through things like watchtowers, aerial photography, surveillance drones, strip searches, which of course are visual tools, brigades of female soldiers who serve as tatzpitaniot, or watchers, who patrol live border cameras from remote viewing stations. And from a visual studies approach, which is the basis of this book, I see the conflict as one that's produced an inequality of visual rights. These are the rights to see and be seen, to look and to surveil, to be out of sight of surveillance, for instance, and to have one's image trusted rather than subjected to what's called digital suspicion through claims of photoshopping, cropping, falsification, and other kinds of mediation in post-production. So I just want to say that this visual studies approach is not unique to Israel-Palestine. In many other conflicts, like this country's conflict between police violence, which is directed against Black and brown bodies, this happens too, where citizens film the cops and the cops film back with body cams. So today I want to talk about a part of the book that considers how cameras act as weapons and how they are specifically positioned in relation to weapons we're more familiar with, like guns. So there's two basic points of view: gunshot point of view and barrel point of view. So in gunshot point of view, cameras are aligned with weapons. So this is where cameras are actually staring out down the sight lines of a gun. So I'm thinking of this image where two Jewish snipers stationed above the Palestinians in the field below are turning themselves in to the newly formed Jewish state in 1948. So here you can see that the direction of the camera is exactly the same as the direction of the gun. I'm also thinking of this, which is a video still from one of the most popular videos on the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF's, YouTube channel. So in this video, a drone enters Israeli airspace, is caught in the sightlines of a missile launcher, and the drone is circled in red here, and then is eliminated in a spectacular midair explosion. So 9 out of 10 of the most popular videos on the IDF's YouTube channel are taken from this point of view, gunshot point of view, which is a position of symbolic and literal shooting power. I'm also thinking of this image. This is where an IDF soldier named Mor Ostrovsky published a photo of a young Palestinian boy caught in the crosshairs of his sniper gun to Instagram. International outcry followed and lamented the dehumanization of Palestinian children as targets. So I contrast that gunshot point of view with barrel point of view, which is where instead of cameras and guns looking in the same direction, instead cameras are facing back and looking at the barrel of a lethal weapon. Some examples of this from the B'Tselem archive. So here, a videographer named Suzanne Zrako films from her roof in Hebron as 2 Israeli soldiers shine lights on her from below. So one is targeting her with the flashlight that's attached to his gun, and the second one with the laser marker attached on his gun. So in this clip, they're literally pointing their guns at her and trying to intimidate her with the lights that are attached to them. In 2013, a B'Tselem volunteer named Muhammad Awad was documenting a protest in his village in Beit Umar, which is in the Hebron district, when he was hit squarely in the chest by an Israeli tear gas canister. The blow of such tear gas canisters has mortally wounded many Palestinian civilians, but luckily Awad survived and recuperated in a hospital. But he captured the exact moment of his bodily injury with the B'Tselem video camera. So you can see in these stills at first, the tear gas canister is sort of above the head of the soldier, and then it zooms towards the camera before it hits him. And Nariman Tamimi, one of the Palestinian leaders of the struggle against the occupation in Nabi Saleh, a West Bank village, she said this. She said, and I need to move my panelist chat away from my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, she said, I think of the camera as a kind of weapon, because with the camera and the photographs I take, I talk with the other so that he or she will change her mind. With my weapon, the camera, I show them the truth about the occupation that the Israeli government is trying to hide from them. So Palestinians who film challenge the right to frame the conflict, exerting a form of control by setting the visual limits of the frame itself. And that camera's provocation is perhaps even tantamount to a gun. One B'Tselem volunteer I interviewed said to me, I feel targeted because of my camera, as if I had a weapon with me. Some B'Tselem volunteers said to me simply, the camera is a weapon. And then this volunteer, Imad Abu Shamsia, turned to my translator and said, it's a beautiful sentence, translate it. And I agree, it is a beautiful sentence. And cameras are weapons, not the kind that inflict bodily harm, but the kind of weapon that's used to take advantage or exert control over an opponent. This B'Tselem volunteer, Imad, filmed what came to be known later as the Hebron shooter incident. And this was when an IDF combat medic named Elor Azaria shot and killed Abed al-Fatah al-Sharif a Palestinian who had carried out a knife attack and was lying wounded but alive on a road in Hebron. Ashraf was alive when the combat medic walked up to him and shot him in the head at point-blank range, killing him. As a result of this footage, the Israeli soldier Azaria was found guilty of manslaughter rather than of the stronger crime of murder and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He served only 9 before being released. I don't want to play this video here as I find it very hard to watch, but I do want to look through some of what this B'Tselem footage looks like. So I'm going to show you a video that was published in 2017 by B'Tselem and is filmed by a videographer named Ahmad Ziada. So in this video, he films his own arrest by Israeli soldiers. And I wanted you to know a few things about this video before I play it. So first, it's about 2 minutes long. It's hard to watch. It has English subtitles, but the actual video has 2 languages in it. So first, the Israeli soldier and B'Tselem volunteer are speaking to each other in Arabic. But when the soldier speaks to his radio or to his fellow soldiers, he switches to Hebrew, which is a language that the B'Tselem volunteer cannot understand. And I want you to pay particular attention to what happens right before the arrest, how the videographer trains his camera on each of the soldiers' faces in turn. So I'll play this now. I'm hoping my sound turned on and you'll be able to hear it.
يلا روح
طخ نهام طخ
روح البيت
انا في البيت انت اللي شو بتسوي هون
روح البيت
انا في البيت انت شو بتسوي هون
روح البيت
انا في البيت هيا في البيت انا كنت انا وعيالي انت اللي شو بتسوي هون
روح البيت
انت اللي شو بتسوي هون
جيب الأوية
نعم بيت سلم بيت سلم
جيب الأوية
هاي هو فيش مشكله بس بيت
جيب
سلم
الأوية
هاي هو
שימו זה
صور בית סלם
3 צעירים, 1 צלמתי עם מצלמה לא שזה מפריע לי יותר מדי יאללה, רוח
انت انا في ارضي في داري
אמרתי לך רוח, נכון?
ايش روح انا واقف هون انت اللي روح انت اللي روح انا واقف في بيتي
רוח אל בית
انا واقف في بيتي انت اللي روح انا واقف ما عامل لك شيء ما مضايقك في شيء انت عكس الشباب طاشي مع بنات انت نزلت وخوفتهم
אני עוד שנייה מתחיל הזיקה פה של אחד מהם עוד קיבלתי, אני לוקח לו את המצלמה עוזק אותו, השני לוחמים שלי יהיו מוכנים בן תוך כדור
هاي الثاني
يلا واقف واقف
هاي الثالث
يلا جيب شيب
فيش كاميرا فيش كاميرا
لا له كدور عليهم
ابعد عني ابعد عني ابعد عني
شيب شيب على الرصبة
ابعد عني
شيب على الرصبة
كله على الكاميرا مبين
شيب
كله على الكاميرا مبين
طيب نروح
كله على الكاميرا مبين
يلا تصور تصور توري يدايم تصور
ما تصورني
لا لا تصور سيان شيب شيب شيب
خليك ايدي وجهك مبين
شيب
هي
توريدو توريدو אחד مكانه אחד مكانه אחד مكانه توريد توريد אחד مكانه אחד مكانه
So in this video, Ziada uses his camera as a tool of exposure. He catalogs the faces of the soldiers, saying, here's the second one and the third. He defends his camera, shouting, not the camera. He uses exposure as a threat, saying, it's all been recorded on the camera. And in the end, he declares hauntingly, your face can be seen, as if to deter the soldier from the violence. Again, in looking at this clip, I'm not asking whether this detention was right or justified. I'm instead asking how the camera is functioning. It's functioning as a tool of exposure. And this is the subject of the first chapter of my book. And the remaining chapters follow as a taxonomy of how cameras are used in the field. So cameras are used to produce shame. Cameras are used as mirrors, as shields, evidence and as weapons. And I want you to remember that the act of arming Palestinians with cameras was meant to reverse the normal order of visual domination under the Israeli occupation, an order where Israelis are empowered with the gaze and Palestinians are reduced to the position of displaying their bodies and IDs, especially displaying their bodies and IDs at checkpoints. And this reversal of visual order is unwelcome by many Jewish Israelis. So here, a Jewish Israeli settler breaks a B'Tselem video camera by smashing it repeatedly against a rock in the South Hebron Hills, as an Israeli activist films. Or here, a Jewish Israeli settler assaults B'Tselem volunteer Raid Abu Armiele, who then falls to the ground and clutches his head. One of his fellow Palestinians picks up his camera to continue filming. Or take this clip, which I turned the sound off on and I'm going to talk over. This clip is filmed in Hebron in the home of the Abu Aisha family. Hebron is the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank and the only one in which ideological Jewish Israelis have settled inside of. Due to frequent settler attacks, there have been cages erected around the homes. So you see the settler flinging Coca-Cola at the videographer, and he slingshots it a direct hit, and then the camera turns off. And then there is also the fight against cameras with light. These are moments where young Jewish settlers realized that they could blind Palestinian cameras with mirrors and the sun. And I share these clips because they show how Jewish Israelis try to fight the exposure of the Palestinian lens, which, remember, is legal and sanctioned in Israel-Palestine. And even the children try to block the camera. And for them, I have to imagine it is some sort of a game that I don't know that they know the stakes of. Here is a camera fight between activist David Shulman, who was volunteering with the group Ta'ayush, who called this the cell phone procedure, where he would go and film and a soldier would instead put his camera right in his nose. So back to this idea of cameras as weapons. Shooting back is, of course, a way to claim power. And fighting for this power looks like an elaborate choreographed dance. In this clip, do you see them moving in duets and trios, as if marking out a waltz only they know? It is an angry waltz, a frustrated one with embarrassment, past wounds, fear, indignancy, sadness, and also, I think, boredom, distraction, and banality. At official scales, the IDF officially established a special unit of what was called combat cameramen, or Lachamim Tsalmim, in 2012. These combat cameramen served in the spokesperson's unit of the IDF as an explicit nod to the way their footage was supposed to be used for PR, and were trained with both elite combat skills and camera skills. Here, an Israeli soldier wears a helmet-mounted GoPro camera as he and fellow soldiers arm themselves to confront a Palestinian demonstration. The IDF has also institutionalized the use of cameras as tools for intimidation of occupied Palestinians in something that's called the mapping procedure. This is a procedure where soldiers search a Palestinian home at night, gather all residents into one room, and photograph them each. These photographs are not the goal of the operation. One former IDF soldier recalls, "Often we erase the image files by the end of the day." So the purpose of the mapping procedure is to use the act of photography itself to instill fear through constant and very intimate surveillance that happens in your own home. And shooting back happens at civilian levels as well. So in 2011, Jewish organizations began providing cameras to Israeli settlers to film back at Palestinians in a direct response to B'Tselem's initiative. In the B'Tselem archive, I found hundreds of instances where cameras faced off against other cameras, where Palestinians and Jewish Israelis face off with personal and civilian cameras, each recording the other in a direct tension of visioning. And here in a 2012 clip from outside Ramallah, a Palestinian videographer named Iyad Haddad videotaped as an Israeli soldier patrolled the aftermath of an Israeli settler attack. Annoyed at Haddad's filming, the soldier took out his own cell phone and filmed back, sticking his phone directly in the lens of Haddad's camera. Haddad seemed to enter a state of disbelief at this response. In broken Hebrew, he says to the soldier, "Ata chayal," meaning, "You're a soldier." The soldier shushed him, but Haddad kept trying. He said, "You're a soldier, be," and he wanted the soldier to be something else, to do something else other than film. And in the end, he became aphasic as he tried to find the right words to beseech some kind of change. So what happens when these images that are simultaneously recorded meet in the field? This is what I call a closed loop of images, and I want to show you an example of this. So I'm going to play this video and talk over what's happening. So in March 2015, IDF soldiers in Hebron raided the Abu Shamshia household at night as part of what seemed to be a mapping procedure. They took a photo of every person in the home, but in searching the house, they found a hard disk, which you can see in the soldier's hand. "What's on here?" they asked, and the father of the home produced his Toshiba laptop so that the soldiers could browse the hard disk themselves. The soldiers then gathered around the laptop and viewed its contents as Faiza Abu Shamshia continued to videotape them with her B'Tselem camera. So as she records these soldiers sitting in her living room, what the soldiers actually browse through are videos of themselves. It's all of the material that this family filmed for the B'Tselem project. And you can see here that as they're watching this, the roles of each party are thoroughly confused in this video. So the Palestinian camera woman is both a photographic subject when the soldiers take a picture of her, and she is a photographer with her own camera. The soldiers are not merely photographic subjects of her camera, but also its spectators, its viewers. They sit and they watch footage, gazing at video images, even as they are simultaneously videotaped. And we as spectators of Faiza's footage see pictures within pictures, an infinite loop of a camera watching a camera. And I think we are left wondering, who should we be watching anyway? What is the subject of this recording? And what, if anything, is the point? So now I'm going to give away the ending of the book, but you should still buy the book, which is that I believe the point of such images is often already determined by who we are and what we think. So I think that instead of seeing is believing, what we have is believing precedes seeing, and therefore it fails to alter our beliefs. I think we need to resist the idea that technology and cameras alone offer emancipation. What is needed is not clearer images or truer images or more images of atrocity. What is needed is not better cameras or more cameras. What is needed is not better ways to validate the truth of images. And what is needed is not merely a wider distribution network for visual recordings. And of course, none of these things would hurt efforts to dismantle the Israeli occupation. But I argue that we must come to accept that images do not speak for themselves, in large part because what one can see in an image is already a matter of a set of power relations that structure vision, visibility, and visuality. This is a pessimistic stance, but I actually think it's a stance that explains the rise of visual or forensic investigations of late, which I discuss at length in my chapter on camera as evidence. So I'm going to take one small detour into this chapter before wrapping up my talk and opening it up to your questions and discussion. So in recent years, citizen recorded media have been elevated not as evidence in and of themselves, but as material for advanced, quote unquote, visual or forensic investigations by firms like Forensic Architecture, Bellingcat, and the New York Times Visual Investigations, to name a few. Such investigations amalgamate many citizen recorded videos to create a final video, which is forensically abstracted, as you see here. And I want to note that the abstraction that you're seeing here has historically been the opposite of B'Tselem's approach to its human rights work, which has focused on details, right? It's focused on dates, names, times, places, and unedited original footage, which B'Tselem says shows the direct experience of the Israeli occupation in a way that can't be ignored. But B'Tselem was becoming frustrated with the lack of impact of its raw videos. So in 2010, they partnered with Forensic Architecture to investigate the death of a Palestinian man named Basim Ibrahim Abu Rama, who was protesting near the separation wall in Bilin when an Israeli soldier fired a tear gas canister at him from a very close range, killing him. Here, in Forensic Architecture's recreation of the scene, Israeli soldiers are the red figures, and the Palestinian man Abu Rama is the green figure on the other side of the separation wall. The yellow emanation from him is a mapping of which Israeli soldier could have possibly fired the fatal shot. And what I want you to notice in this abstract rendering is that it replaces Abu Rama's image with an aestheticized abstraction devoid of human attributes. Abu Rama becomes a mere silhouette of the person he once was. So in other words, he is killed once by the Israeli munition and again by the abstraction. The uncanniest use of abstracted bodies is in Forensic Architecture's 2018 analysis of the killing of Luai Khalil and Amir al-Nimra, two Palestinian teenagers who were sitting on a rooftop in Gaza when they were killed by an Israeli missile. Before they were killed, the teenagers took a selfie that became the last photograph of them alive. Forensic Architecture used the photograph, together with multiple other videos, to recreate the teenagers and the building in computer graphics, or CG. The boys are shown in shades of whites and gray here, like ghosts. But then the boys' selfie is reinscribed onto the rendering, aligning their likeness with their CG bodies. The resultant image vibrates between the uncanny valley of CG and the messy representations of the world of the living, a vibration that, if anything, highlights the disconnection between the two. When actual Palestinian bodies are presented in Forensic Architecture's videos, they are often instrumentalized to synchronize multiple videos, like a clap. So the real bodies of Palestinians appear only in service to the forensic analysis. I argue that we should remain wary of this abstraction for two important reasons. It both homogenizes Palestinians, meaning it treats them as if they are all the same, and it erases them, making them ghosts. Homogenization and erasure are two key tactics utilized by the Israeli militarized occupation to both discredit and dehumanize Palestinians and continue an oppressive regime of violence. Even though I think we should be wary of forensic abstraction, I do see some utility and good in it. And here I am thinking of the two types of injustice defined by legal scholar Nancy Fraser. The first type is ordinary political misrepresentation. So these are injustices in which a civil society deny people the opportunity to participate in decision-making. So for instance, a citizen is denied a fair trial under law. And the second kind is meta-political injustice. This is when a civil society wrongly draws the boundary of citizenship itself. So when women were denied the right to vote, for instance, they suffered meta-political injustice. They were not counted as full citizens. This kind of injustice is higher order, right? It is meta-political. It is perpetuated by an act of misframing persons outside the edges of political, as if pushing them outside the boundaries of a frame or of a photograph. And throughout the course of B'Tselem's history, it has operated under the assumption that Palestinians were victims of the first injustice, ordinary political misrepresentation. Palestinians were denied fair access to file the grievances and to seek judicial redress in the Israeli legal system. And B'Tselem sought to remedy this by the use of detailed video as evidence in judicial litigation. But of course, this did not work. Palestinians have not been merely denied representation. They have been misframed as non-citizens. No amount of videos can make this evident. The evidence itself lies in the boundaries of the video frame. This concept requires generalization, abstraction, and higher order thinking. And this is the kind of injustice that forensic abstraction has the potential to lay bare. So to close, I want to return to my pessimistic stance that seeing is not believing. Because while this stance is perhaps pessimistic, I think it yields that the meaning of an image and your response to it as a viewer is not fixed or overdetermined by the image. Instead, that meaning is determined by the framing of an image, which is iterative and volatile, and which dominant regimes use their power to control. And of course, we know that a regime's domination over the frame will change depending on who holds power. In the US, images of Black lynchings used to circulate as souvenirs that celebrated white supremacy. Today, we see those images very differently. The images themselves have not changed. It is that we as a society have begun to do the very important and difficult work of acknowledging racial injustice and white supremacy. So I will end by reading a bit from the book's closing words. If I am able to locate a sense of optimism in one place, it is in the video archives of the B'Tselem Camera project. When an archive lives on in digital form, it can become available for a critical reopening, a hearing, a future reckoning. It is in the archive that Mamie Till revisioned her son Emmett's funeral, holding an open casket ceremony for him in the first public showing of a Black lynching that was not intended for white supremacist scare tactics, but for Black justice. The B'Tselem video archives do not sit still, but circulate in web browsers and theaters, in high-resolution videos, and in pixelated bits of scenes streaming through poor internet connections. The future potential of the archive is why B'Tselem volunteer Widian Zaban films. Today, there is no justice, she told me, but she feels the things she films are bigger than herself and her present moment. She gives her footage to B'Tselem, though she does not personally experience any relief from the injustices she records, because, as she put it, maybe with time, in future generations, there can be justice. I think these archives can live on to haunt us. And haunting, of course, is a thing that happens to visibility, right? Ghosts appear as blurring the lines between the visible and the invisible. A ghost haunts a person not by touch or by smell, but with a sudden appearance to the eyes. In the B'Tselem archives, images refuse to disappear. And in their refusal, they can come to visually disturb the future in their call for justice that is denied in the present. And so, as Susan Sontag said, let the atrocious images haunt us. And I'd add, let the banal images haunt us too. Those images of the slow, suspended violence of the Israeli occupation. When I asked all the B'Tselem volunteers which of their videos were particularly memorable to them, one woman looked at me and declared, "Everything is memorable." And she is right. Let all the images haunt us. And may these images live on as a future archive of haunting that demands a political reckoning. Thank you.
Yeah, wow, thank you so much. What a wonderful, wonderful presentation and a wonderful book too. The talk provides such a kind of a rich entryway into such a thick and complex book project, and it's been a real joy to read the book and to think with you in preparation for our getting together today. So please, those in the audience, please go ahead and use the Q&A box for questions, and I'll serve as the moderator for the conversation. And, you know, there are so many places that we could start the conversation. And so maybe I'll say one thing as a comment, and then pivot to a kind of question. And so, you know, your work does such a wonderful job of kind of accounting for the power of framing, right? That the frame does so much work to shape the kind of knowledge that we garner, or that we bring already to a particular visual artifact, right? And the ways in which you have seeing is believing as a kind of Derridian, like under erasure in your slides, I think really resonates for me in that regard. And one thing that I really appreciate about your project is how, you know, at least in kind of the dominant kind of visual economy in the US context, the frame is, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, is one of atrocity and spectacular forms of violence, right? That sort of are punctuated by a kind of rhythm of warfare, kinetic warfare, military warfare. And one thing that I find so powerful about the work that B'Tselem is doing, and that you're surfacing and you're sort of framing for us, is precisely the banal or quotidian dimensions of life under occupation. That's such a rich and kind of important intervention, I think, into how we think about the visual economy of Israel and Palestine in the US. And so I guess my first question would be, in a way, about curation. So, you know, you show us how there are, you know, over 4,500 hours of footage in the B'Tselem archives, but only a small slice of that has been made public or has kind of circulated online. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about either what folks at B'Tselem would tell you about what they chose to sort of publicize more broadly, or what kind of patterns you could see in that kind of distinction between, you know, this massive archive and then this much more curated set of materials circulating kind of online.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. And you know, when I went to the B'Tselem archives to start looking at the material, I really didn't go with an agenda. And the first thing that I began doing was sort of collecting images that were alike with each other. So I had this whole collection that was, you know, cameras facing off with cameras. At the same time, I also had a whole collection that was just footage of people waiting. Because one thing that became so clear to me in looking at this footage is that, like you say, that the Israeli occupation is not just a producer of spectacular violence, it's also a producer of slow or suspended violence, to use Ariella Azulay and Adi Ophir's term, right? This kind of violence that actually takes time and that is not spectacular, but that is structural and systemic in the way it oppresses. And I found this on both sides. So there was so much footage of Palestinians waiting at checkpoints. And there was also a lot of footage of Israeli soldiers who had been told to go to a protest line and just wait there for the protest to arrive. And I don't say that sort of to say that both of these waitings are equivalent, but it became clear to me that a lot of what was filmed was in part this very slow violence of the occupation, where the occupation presents itself by costing time, by taking time, right? By putting people through endless lines of bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the reasons I ended up working with the B'Tselem footage was that it actually is distinct in Israel-Palestine as producing, like recording, producing, and sharing images that kind of spread themselves all the way across the way the occupation manifests. So many of you might be familiar with the 5 Broken Cameras film, which was specifically about demonstrations in the West Bank against the wall. And there were other projects like that. So I'm thinking of the Melian Media Group, who recorded primarily demonstrations. Okay, B'Tselem chooses instead to try to present not just sort of eruptive violence, but also housing demolitions, violence to agricultural fields, where Palestinian shepherds or farmers are trying to go to their fields and are obstructed or met by settlers. They show footage of settler violence. So they really try. When I was speaking to the people who run the video department, they really do try to show the many different faces of the occupation beyond the spectacular. I think it's instructive to see how they've done that over the years. And one thing that I've noticed in their published footage, so this is the little bit that's published, not just in the archive, is that they used to really have this complete fidelity to the raw footage. So they would publish unedited footage. They would not add any video annotations or markers to it. So unlike the IDF's footage where they circle the drone they're about to eliminate, they would not do any of that. And that was primarily because at the time they were truly viewing this footage as it might be evidence used in a court of law. Lately, what I've been noticing is that they're including many more annotations, right? So understanding that the people who view their footage are not going to be in a court, but rather in the court of public opinion. And that the public, in their eye, needs things to be highlighted, to be circled. They need language to be explained. So it's not just a settler, but an Israeli settler, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing that I talk about a little bit in the book, and I think reflects the organization's shift away from viewing this material as litigious and legal evidence, and towards viewing it as something that can exert pressure through the public sphere, through the forum, right? The forensis and the accumulation of it in the public eye. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's, in talking with them, that's a trend that I've seen. And that's one thing that sets their archive apart from many other citizen recorded archives in Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, oh, that's so interesting. It's so interesting to sort of see that shift in audience or presumptive audience as also, in a way, kind of a shift in framing or the interpretive frame that that the producers are bringing to bear on the archive, right? So it's rather than have a sort of a legal setting for this footage to be able to circulate as a kind of evidence that can be marshaled to make legal claims with all the kinds of kind of peculiar legal framings that might be involved there. Instead, there's a kind of project of annotation to identify what it is that we ought to be focusing on when we're looking at some footage. It's such a rich and interesting project, and there's something that you just began to point to a little bit in the talk that maybe you could talk a little bit more about, is in the way in which the kind of project of making claims to the public shifts. Like what are the aims in turning to a kind of public audience as opposed to a legal or court-based audience? What what do B'Tselem or the citizen videographers see in sort of shifting audiences?
Yeah, so I'll say that I think that answer is very different for B'Tselem video than it is for the videographers who are filming on the ground. When I spoke to videographers who are filming on the ground, especially in Hebron, a lot of the reason they were filming was literally to protect themselves, their community, and their families. So the camera was a shield. It was a protective element to deter settler violence. And literally the act of filming was this defense. And it was actually primarily a defense that was carried out by women videographers who were using it to shield their families and their children. And in response to that, we began to see more footage of Israeli settlers coming masked, okay, where they had previously been unmasked. So in terms of the audience, I think there's often many layers. And I think for the videographers on the ground, first and foremost, oftentimes it's used as a shield, or not just a shield, but as oftentimes an alibi. So even though this Israeli settler said I hit him, here's the footage, I didn't. So many videographers found that it was basically impossible for their footage to incriminate an Israeli citizen. But it was possible for their footage to basically protect them, to protect the Palestinian from a claim of wrongdoing where they hadn't done something. So that's really interesting that this footage is used as an alibi. And then there is that third audience of the world, right? The whole world is watching. And this idea that this footage can cause change in a broader economy of images and a broader political economy. That's the goal that, that's where the B'Tselem headquarters comes in my opinion. And of course, they would have their own way of answering this question. So I can't purport to represent them, right? I don't work with them. But I think that's the question the organization has been asking for many, many years. And in a sense, their original audience was Israelis. Jewish Israelis. They thought this footage, if we could only show Jewish Israelis what's being carried out in their names, if we could only show them the truth of the occupation, the public opinion will sway against occupation, because there's no way that Jewish Israelis can see this and continue to support it. So that was the original mission when B'Tselem was founded in the late 80s. Of course, now we are, over 5 decades into the occupation, and that has not come to bear. And so now the organization has shifted away from that and decided that they would like to actually think of their audience as more international, in part because they see that as a way to put pressure on the state of Israel to end the occupation. So this is where we begin to see B'Tselem coming out with a white paper that calls the Israeli occupation an apartheid. Right? This is where we see B'Tselem seeking out and accepting invitations to present their work at the UN. So what was before a really internal campaign instead becomes a campaign that has a much more global scale.
That's so great. That's really so fascinating to think about the shifts in scales and audience and the shifting modes of argumentation too. I have a really small technical question, and then there's a wonderful question in the chat that I'll circle back to. But the small technical question is, so the 1980s, B'Tselem's been around since the 1980s. You say the camera distribution project starts in 2007. What was the catalyst, for turning to this kind of citizen videography? Had something shifted on the ground, something in leadership, something in the sort of the ways in which the visual was being thought about?
Yeah, so the way B'Tselem tells the story of how the camera project started is this. And I should say, before they started the camera project, they were largely collecting testimonies about human rights violations. They were collecting statistics, creating maps, and they still are in the business, if you can call an NGO a business. They were in the business of basically aggregating statistics. To this day, if you want to find the names of all the Palestinians who've been killed in a specific Israeli military operation, B'Tselem is the one that holds that, right? So that was sort of their business, was statistics, but then also individual episodes of human rights violations, going and gathering testimony from Palestinians, publishing that testimony, and sometimes illustrating it with a few pictures. So the story of the camera project began in 2007. And at that time, B'Tselem's staff went to Hebron, and they went to tour the area where Israeli Jewish settlers have settled in the midst of a Palestinian population. Because there had been a lot of reports of settler violence there. And that's where you saw the videos of those cage houses, right? Where Palestinians had to erect cages around their houses because there was so much debris thrown at them by Israeli settlers. And when they were touring Hebron, they decided to give a video camera to one family there just to see what would happen. So they gave a video camera to the Abu Aisha family. And the first clip that they got back was this clip that is quite widely known in Israeli culture. It's called the Sharmuta video. And in this video, there's an Israeli settler woman who is like screaming at a Palestinian teenage girl. And she's yelling at her, Sharmuta, Sharmuta, which means whore in Arabic. And she's trying to force her back into her house, saying like, whore, don't come in the street. And so she's basically acting like a settler colonialist, saying, the street is my space, that house is your space, and I'm going to try to shame you into returning to it. And it was one of the first times in broader Jewish Israeli society that Jewish Israelis did see the perspective of a Palestinian. Because previously there had been this idea of the Palestinian as the one who is enacting the violence, who is going out into the street and who is invading the Jewish space. And instead what you saw here was instead an Israeli Jew who was instead acting as the aggressor. And so from that point on, they began distributing cameras widely. So it wasn't, it really began with that one tour they had of Hebron and that experiment to give a camera to one family.
Oh, that's amazing. What a rich and evocative story in so many ways. And it points in some sense to a question that Jeffrey Scholar has posed in the Q&A box that I'll just read out for us here to see if you'd like to respond. So Jeffrey writes, you end with the ultimate value of the work as a haunting and a promise of its value for the future. But what is the act of filming itself as a phenomenon of the present? The activity of filming as a form of agency and as a catalyst for a kind of active engagement and an embodiment of the possibility of resistance. What is it to have the camera in the home in the context of occupation? What is it to speak back with the camera in that moment?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for being here and for asking it. So when I end on that future-oriented point, it's sort of my own way of trying to understand and answer this question of can images secure justice? Can images change a socio-political order on the broader sphere? I think that question is very different than the question of what is a camera doing on the ground. And that, what a camera is doing on the ground, right? What it is to speak back with a camera in the moment, like you write so beautifully, is in a way to do what Ahmed Ziada was saying, to use the camera as a tool of exposure, saying your face can be seen. And in that, speaking back with the camera and with his language to say, don't commit violence against me. I have this footage here. Or it's a way to try to deter violence, right? Like I was talking about in Hebron, the use of cameras to deter settler violence. And by the way, we see this in many different scenarios. That's why there's a market for fake security cameras. Okay, this is not just in Israel-Palestine. Cameras are often thought of as a way to deter some kind of action that's unwanted. And I think this speaking back with cameras is happening from the Israeli side as well. So that's where you see the mapping procedure, where the point of taking a photo of each Palestinian resident in the home is not to have the image, but it's instead to use the instrumentality of the act of photography to instill fear or to demand some kind of compliance. So the act of photography in and of itself becomes a way, in my opinion, becomes a way to demand something, whether it's protection, whether it's an alibi, whether it's a continuation of the occupation. It has a very, very different way of operating on the ground. And in one of my chapters, I also talk about how it becomes a way to try to mirror back to an oppressor. Hey, look at this footage of yourself. And I thought that was some of the most interesting moments in the B'Tselem archive is when I actually saw instances of soldiers looking at footage of themselves. So that's where the closed loop of image happens. Like, how do you react? And in some ways, the soldiers react by deleting the footage, right? So we can't see it anymore. They remove it from the visual record, which I think speaks to the potency of the image, right? I'd rather have this image removed than not. And of course, there have been anecdotes of footage swaps. So where a B'Tselem videographer agrees, yeah, I'll give you my tape if you'll release my friend from detention. And the Israeli military will not say that they do such things, but anecdotally on the ground, I've heard that from B'Tselem volunteers. So to speak back with the camera in the moment is to exert a kind of power, right? It's the power to free yourself. It's the power to demand the freedom of someone else who's being held, the power to kind of try to create a shield around you, and a power to say, I'm setting the frame, right? You don't get the chance to set the frame, the visual frame, even though you Israelis are the oppressor. And I'll just end, I know I've been going long on this question, but I'll just end by mentioning a clip from a film that I think does this so well. So there's this clip from an Elias Suleiman film, It Must Be Heaven, where the female lead, Manal Kadar, she's a Palestinian, and she is walking through an Israeli checkpoint, and she's a femme fatale, and the Israeli soldiers are shouting at her like, stop, you can't walk through. And she just keeps going. And in the final moment, she takes off her sunglasses and she looks directly at them, which of course is the ultimate moment of lack of compliance at a checkpoint. Instead of averting your gaze, you are looking back. And as a result, in the film, their watchtower, the Israeli watchtower, just collapses completely spectacularly, right? It's as if the very act of Palestinian looking is what shatters the Israeli system of visual domination. And so I think in the moment, that is what the cameras are doing as well.
Such a rich moment, and the power there of vision to be so effective, right, at not only challenging the sort of the structures of occupation and confinement, but breaking through those structures or breaking down those structures is just so rich. And there's a way in which, there's a way in which you're grappling with the question of haunting. Strikes me as another way of getting at sort of what happens when we linger on these on this archive of slow violence, to allow ourselves to sit with it and look at it, and what kinds of frames we might be able to construct otherwise than the ones that are present before us. In thinking a little bit more about framing, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to frame this project as an academic book. You have such a rich and an incredible vita as an artist and a performance artist and a new media producer, and a digital media producer. So how did you come to the sort of the frame of the academic monograph as the one to bring this into the world?
Yeah, it didn't ever seem like a given. I mean, before this was a book, it was many other things. At first, I began working with the B'Tselem footage as an artist and producing video pieces from it, producing interactive works where your voice would end up controlling the footage. Then I made a performative lecture with the piece, which ultimately became some writing, and then the book. And as an artist, I never quite feel like the medium that I work in is predetermined when I start a project. I often throw many mediums at a project and see what sticks. And so I'll start a project and first it'll be a video series, then it'll be a series of images, then it'll be a performance. And for me, it's almost like using my mathematics background, like I'm taking a formula and I'm just plugging in many things into it to see what sticks. So for me, the book doesn't feel like it's the end. It feels like just another medium I've put at it, although it is a medium that takes a lot longer than many that I normally engage with. And I will say that being an artist who's in academia, it is a medium that my institution supported, right? So my institution gave me a sabbatical for this project. And in that way, academia certainly has structured the way in which this project came about. But I don't think it's done. Like, I don't think that the book is the end. It feels like another thing I'm throwing at it to see what sticks.
Are you willing to tell us a little bit about what you see next in your engagement with these questions or with this archive?
Yeah. For this project in particular, there is a part of me that wonders what a different kind of book would look like, honestly. Like what a book that is image first, text second would look like. So I'm thinking about works like Ariella Azoulai's From Palestine to Israel that really interrogates the image first and does interpretations after. I'm also thinking, this project has gotten me really interested in image and video archives. And a lot of my work lately has been about the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, which is also called Keren Kayemet L'Israel, or the KKL. And they have an incredible archive of images that documents the way that this organization planted trees all over Israel and Palestine, and did so systematically to hold and secure land for primarily Jewish inhabitation, and actually exclusive Jewish habitation. So before there were enough people to hold the land, enough Jewish people to hold the land, trees were put there sort of in their stead. And so I've scraped their archive, and I'm working with it and thinking through how I might look through their archive differently than they have it cataloged, to see kind of an alternate history than the one they want to tell about themselves. So that's a project that I'm working on next, and that, that I'm not quite sure where it will go, but it can sort of continues looking at images as a way to tell a story about Israel and Palestine. And it's one that also has my own personal involvement. So I planted a tree in the Jerusalem forest when I was 5 years old. And I was taken there by my parents, and I'm asking sort of what is my responsibility in this situation? What are the roots that I have laid down? Is my tree even alive? If so, what does that mean? And so looking at ways that we use ecology as a way to set up facts, set up geopolitical facts, is something that I'm thinking about next, and how we then document that ecology photographically to also set up and secure geopolitical facts.
Mm. When I was just in college, at the outset of my college days, and did one of these kind of whirlwind 10-day trips for American Jews to Israel. And our first stop was to plant a tree in a JNF forest. And there was a photographer there who took my picture on a Polaroid and gave it to me, and asked me to think about a relative that I would want to hold dear in planting this photo. And then he, gave me the Polaroid and gave me the flag. And sure enough, I returned, 2 weeks later and found my grandfather who I'd had on my mind, and gave him the photo. And, there's a way in which the very tangible kind of project of claiming the land as Jewish and Israeli, and as building roots for diaspora American Jews to participate in that project was a really powerful one, a highly staged and choreographed one, and a highly framed one too, right? It's sort of, it didn't take much critical thinking on my part to get a sense of what it was that was going on in this moment. So I'm thrilled to hear that you're working on the JNF kind of photo archive. That's incredible.
Yeah, and it's a very embodied action, right? Like you dug a hole, you put that tree in the land. And I think not that it's embodied in the same way that filming back is, or that holding a camera is, but I do think that these are both very embodied responses to a specific settler colonial regime. So I think that's an interesting connection between them. And even in you telling the story of you, I can picture you doing it, right? I've seen similar photographs and I can picture it happening.
Yeah. Well, Liat, thank you so much for such a rich and compelling presentation, and such a really, really wonderful book. It's been a real joy to think with you, and to learn from your work. And I'm excited to see the next iteration of this project as you move forward.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you everyone for being here. It's been really an honor.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. It's been great sharing this time and space with you. Thanks to the staff in BCNM. Thank you all for coming, and we'll connect again very soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.